Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. My name's Anna from the TUC, and I'm joined by two fantastic guests today. We've got my colleague Suko, and she'll be talking to us later about the steps that reps can take in the workplace to build a culture that prevents sexual harassment from occurring in the first place. And we've got Alison Henderson from the Fawcett Society, who actually will be speaking to us first, talking to us about the prevalence of sexual harassment and some key issues from a report that the Fawcett Society has recently produced. A little bit of just housekeeping before we get going. As always, we've got live captions on the webinar. There's a green button underneath the video that says open live transcript. Please click that and you'll be able to open a screen where we have live captions running. If you want to ask a question of our speakers, click the ask a question button, which is right at the bottom of the screen. You can post your questions there and we'll try and get to them after the presentations. We'll answer as many as we can in that time. Great to see, as ever, people using the chat panel on the right hand side to introduce themselves, tell us where you're from, but please also use it to exchange advice. You might have some tips for each other about this. As great, it's always good to see some interaction there. Okay, this is our last webinar of 2021, by the way. We've had a great run this year. We've got an exciting programme planned for next year as well, but I'll tell you a bit more about that afterwards. So we've heard quite a lot recently about sexual harassment at work, both on our webinars and in the wider world and through the TUC and lots of other organisations. And we know what a problem it is. We know that it's caused lots of people distress and upset, and we know that this is something that we should all be working on. What we've often covered before is what workplace reps can do when they're supporting a member who's experienced sexual harassment. But what we're going to look at today is a little bit different. It's about how we can work with management and with our members to build a culture that prevents sexual harassment even occurring in the first place. So it's a bit different from what we've previously done. So I'm looking forward to hearing some exciting ideas of things we could do. So, as I said, we're joined by Alison Henderson. I'm going to hand over to her first. Just give me one moment while I load up her presentation. Alison, I'm just going to unmute you so you can introduce yourself while I'm loading that up.
Hi, thanks, Anna. I'm Alison Henderson. I'm the Policy and Research Manager at the Fawcett Society. And my background with the Fawcett is been with them about the last year and a half. And previous to that, I spent a lot of time at Transport for London, which, believe me, did a fair amount of work on sexual harassment in the workplace. So we have completed a report this summer on tackling sexual harassment in the workplace, focusing particularly on what employers can do to prevent and respond to workplace sexual harassment. So we can move on to the next one, Anne. So why now on this topic? Well, in the summer, fairly well hidden among releases on violence against women generally, the government committed to legislation for a duty on employers to prevent sexual harassment. And this is much wider than in the past. The current legislation is much more preventive it's about defending after the event. And it just requires the employer to have taken reasonable steps to prevent it. This new legislation we expect to go much wider and to focus on how they prevent it in a much more active manner. And this is really interesting because it's the government recognizing that harassment is not about the aberrant behavior of a few people, that it is something that happens generally. It recognizes that it's results from structural inequalities based in sexism, basically. And also, I think importantly, and something I'll come back to, is that it doesn't have to be assault or something really serious to be enormously traumatic and degrading on a daily basis for many people. It's just exhausting and horrible to deal with. So I think everybody knows the definition. Workplace sexual harassment is unwanted behavior of a sexual nature. It results from a culture and things like jokes, comments, looks, intrusive questions, and of course these days email and other sort of social and electronic forms of behaviors still count as sexual harassment. And the other thing I would say as introduction is that it's a really serious matter for organisations. In Australia, analysis by Deloitte suggested that workplace sexual harassment resulted in $2.6 billion Australian dollars of lost productivity. And we also demonstrated in our report that employees who experience sexual harassment have lower mental and physical health, lower job satisfaction, and organisational engagement. So it's something that's really worth working on. So what did we look at in our report? Primarily, we carried out a review of evidence about what's already known, and particularly looking for what works to help prevent sexual harassment. We also accompanied this with a call for evidence from women who've experienced sexual harassment, what improvements they think should be done, and what's currently happening out there with employers. And we're very grateful to them for their voices, which are key in understanding how can make change from what has been an upsetting experience, a horrible experience for them. And finally, I think something relatively unusual, we did a survey of managers in partnership with the Chartered Management Institute and understood how managers perceive this, what they perceive of what their employers are doing, and what they think would help and make best practice. And this is part of a wider project we're doing, Chwaraeg, WRDA in Northern Ireland, Close the Gap in Scotland, and we will be producing an employer toolkit aimed very much at what employers and leaders should be doing to tackle sexual harassment. So, what is the problem in our workplaces? So, what we have found is that many managers just don't know what to do, and the employers are very ineffectual. So, this is evidence from the Equality and Human Rights Commission. Employers in more than half of cases took no action, minimized the incident, placed the responsibility on the employee to avoid the harasser. In our call for evidence, women told us that they faced inaction or dismissal, discouragement to file a formal report, insufficient and inappropriate action, and poor handling of the investigation and grievance process, up to blame and punishment landing on them for something which is not something they did. A particularly disturbing thing is often what happens is managers move the women away from their roles rather than moving the harasser, which can have a very damaging effect on career as well as motivation, and as well as sending the wrong message about who really needs to change their behaviour. So then looking at managers, many of them don't know how to respond. Sorry, Anna, I think we've ended up out of sync. Of those taking part in the manager survey, only 14% had dealt with a report of sexual harassment in their workplace. And of those managers, less than half felt supported to deal with it. So because currently it's dealt with in this very defensive manner, it only happens occasionally, and managers are just left, frankly, terrified. Often they're men, they're afraid of being accused of doing the wrong thing, and you can see it all kind of going wrong and getting worse and worse in combination because people don't know what to do. But managers did tell us they want to do better. They were frustrated at the poor handling of these things and had seen reports brushed aside. They wanted to do more, and they wanted comprehensive training. So, for example, again, we found some male managers more inclined to go and talk to the harasser, get the wrong end of the stick, muddle everything up. So training needs to be comprehensive and the same for everybody, and particularly for managers on how to respond to this, so that you get a consistent response, whether it's sort of jokes in one part of the organisation or leering or whatever in another part of the organisation. It should be dealt with in similar ways. So what this adds up to is that sexual harassment is enormously underreported, as many of you have probably know and have experienced. 4 in 5 workers do not report. That's in fact TUC data. Because of this focus on paper-based compliance, and because this response becomes an individualized response to what is a wider institutional problem. So it cannot result in the culture shift needed to prevent it and to make women feel safe to come forward with reports. Women can also risk victimization and retaliation because of them getting blamed for things, because not being supported when they report. And so they don't want to risk compounding a negative experience by exposing it to someone who's unsympathetic and unprepared. So in our survey, we got some responses from managers and also from the women themselves. And apologies if these are difficult for anyone to hear who has been affected by sexual harassment. So here's a woman in the private sector at the top left. She's saying, they were asking, am I sure this is sexual harassment? I went to the government website and showed them a description, and they were still asking, am I sure? The woman below in the public sector says, they believe me, but they seem to know what to do. They seem to think I could do something. So it's that blaming the woman again. And over at the top right, a woman in the private sector said, my employer should have just once said, sorry this has happened to you, let us help. So here we're starting to see some examples of how to do it a bit better. The woman in the private sector in the centre, she says, here's a good experience. What worked well was the person I told was a more senior woman. She took my report seriously. She expressed sympathy and shock. This felt validating and gave me confidence to speak to HR. So that will be when you start going through the process. And finally, on the right-hand side here, we've got a comment from a manager. It's a middle manager in the public sector. And he's saying, it would be useful to have a dedicated trained manager to champion this. I am a male in my mid-40s and I manage a team in their mid-20s. Whilst I hope I'm approachable and will always respond to any reports of sexual harassment, I understand speaking to me may be another daunting step for a victim. So great to see some managers do know what can be difficult about this and just want the support to do it right, get it better. So how can we address this? So our analysis from the best practice evidence from the women who talk to us and the managers is that there are 5 key requirements to address this. So the first one is culture change. So I'm starting at the top of the circle. And our research and recommendations, because we're focused on employers, culture is very important. It underlies all the structural things you will do. It's the soft side to sort of go along the sort of formal hard side of rules, procedures, etc. So the idea is to get it out of this idea that minor sexual harassment is a normal part of the workplace and women should just put up with it. We're trying to get away from all that idea. And that requires changing the norms in the workplace. So this means creating and maintaining a culture, and that's necessary for everything else in this to work. So elements of that would be improving equality, diversity, and inclusion at senior levels in particular. Demonstrating leadership commitment with having leaders hold each other to account, and we definitely often don't see that. And them actually just communicating that harassing behaviours will not be tolerated and that they're committed to addressing all incidents, small and large, with seriousness and professionalism. And also a climate survey, which I think Sue is going to come on to talk about a little bit, is a useful element in understanding the culture in the workplace. The second element would be policy. A unique, separate sexual harassment policy. Again, I think something Sue's going to talk about. In our survey of managers, support for the 9 elements that we described was high, with the 9 in 10 managers agreeing all those elements would help them. Communication of this kind of policy and things around it would be important, and 3/4 of the women in our call for evidence supported internal communications to support that and to make sure people were aware of the policy and how to use it in practice. The third key requirement is training. Now, this is the element most people may have encountered already, but it can't work by itself. Sue will talk about this as well, I think, but 9 in 10 managers wanted training on what to do and how to respond to a report and support from their managers. And a really important and interesting element of training is bystander training, because what this does is it reframes the role of men involved as allies instead of them just being stuck sort of feeling, are they always sort of possibly the perpetrator or in that kind of group? So I think that's an important opportunity. So then the fourth element is reporting mechanisms. And I would say the crucial thing is to make it safe and make it easy to report. 4 in 5 managers supported informal reporting, and the women in our call for evidence were very supportive of workplaces where there's training for someone to receive and handle sexual harassment reports specifically. 7 in 10 of women who did not already report an experience of sexual harassment would like an anonymous reporting route. And there's a lot more in our report on this as well, on the different avenues for doing this. Finally, the 5th key requirement is the way the employer responds. And I think this is another kind of key element, and we got quite a bit from managers about this. And I think really in talking to employers, I cannot emphasize this element enough. So women told us they want to be listened to and taken seriously. So the employer should be treating all employees who report with respect and with empathy. Absolutely crucial. So a person within the workforce could be trained to receive reports and support the abused person. One of our women in the private sector said, this would have permitted me to bring the problem to light and believe it will be dealt with without humiliating me. And this, of course, is why sexual harassment is such a lovely tool, because it's usually about power. But by using those degrading, humiliating kind of routes, it throws the problem onto the person who's basically being attacked and hides the fact that the one who's got the problem is the person in power who's feeling their power is in some way being diminished or attacked or something along those lines. The important thing in this is that employers need to provide that guidance and support to managers to gain the consistency, and preferably it should be trauma-informed training or people with that experience who can support or act as independent support. The final element of the employer response to reports is to publish the data, be transparent about what's going on in your organization so that everyone can know, and it's another thing that helps to change the norms by publishing the actual realities. And I think, again, that's something Sue will mention. So I think that takes me through pretty much everything. Each of these areas is interconnected. Good action in one reinforces good action in another. And the trouble is that the vice versa is true as well. If you fail to address one of these five, the others won't operate properly. So you do need the full set. And then you're looking for that virtuous circle of improvement. The last thing I would say is that successful and lasting change requires sustained commitment. And our report aims to set out to do this. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Alison, for that really interesting and detailed introduction to the subject. I think we've all learned a lot about how prevalent this issue is in workplaces and the key things that need to be done in order to change the culture. Just for those of you who are interested in reading the full report, my colleague Tanya has just posted a link to it in the chat panel on the right-hand side. But you can either take a note of that now, or we'll send you a link to it in our follow-up email to the webinar later today. When we send out the recording, we'll send a link to the report where you can read about all the detail that Alison has started to introduce us to here. So all of this information about creating a changed culture in the workplace is something that workplace reps can push management to do, that they can bring up with management and present evidence to management about how we can change this culture and why it's important to change these things. So I'm just going to load up your presentation, Sue, and you can get going in 1 second. Just give me a... Okay, I think you can get going.
Thanks so much for that, Anna. And I think what Alison has done is talked us through some of those really important facts and figures around sexual harassment at work. As you know, as she's highlighted, we know around half of women experience sexual harassment at work, and that rises to 2/3 for young women, disabled women, and for LGBT plus workers. And as you know from your experience as reps, and as Alison highlighted, the vast majority of workers who experience sexual harassment don't report it because of the significant number of barriers that there are. And we know that an approach that is based only in responding to complaints just doesn't work. It will only ever deal with the tip of the iceberg. And it allows sexual harassment to be presented as an issue of just a few bad apples, rather than tackling the workplace cultures that support and enable harassment. So what we want to do, as well as effectively supporting those who've experienced sexual harassment at work, is to work to prevent sexual harassment before it happens. And as Alison flagged, you know, with unions and a range of other organisations, including the Fawcett Society, we campaigned for and we won a commitment from government to change the law, so that employers are legally required to take all reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment from work. But with delays to the employment bill, you know, we can't sit around and wait for government to act. What we need to do is to build those preventative cultures in our workplaces now. And that's why we've worked with experts on sexual harassment to develop materials that help reps achieve this. So what we've developed, if you can move the slide on, Anna, is a 5-step process. And it's really important, I think, to see all these steps as equally important and interlinked, and that we can't actually start to build preventative cultures if we just take one of these steps. For example, you can have the best anti-sexual harassment policy on earth, and if you haven't got these other steps around it, it won't help to change cultures in the workplace. So what we have is this self-supporting 5-step implementation framework that I just want to run you through step by step, and this will help build those cultures that we all want to achieve that stop sexual harassment from occurring. And the first and most important step as a starting point is just to understand what is happening in terms of sexual harassment in the workplace. You need to establish a baseline for yourself, because we know, as we've said again and again, even in this short amount of time, the vast majority of people who've experienced sexual harassment don't come forward and report it. So very few workplaces actually have a clear idea of what is happening in terms of sexual harassment in the workplace. So what we have done is develop a model anonymous climate survey, and also guidance to support implementation of that. This survey has been really carefully designed because we know there's really poor understanding of what constitutes sexual harassment at work. As I've seen kind of happening in the chat, sexual harassment can be dismissed as banter, or excuses can be given that people didn't intend to do it. So it's if you just ask people, have you been sexually harassed, you won't get an accurate picture. So what we've done is developed this kind of detailed anonymous survey to help actually uncover what the position is in terms of people's experiences of sexual harassment at work, and also what people feel about the organisational culture. Moving on to the second point. Once you've done this kind of climate survey, you understand what the prevalence is and what workers feel about the culture. It's really important the steps are taken to assess, identify, and reduce risks that there are to workers in the workplace. And what we have done, as I've linked here and we'll share in the chat, and as Anna said, we'll email to you afterwards, is we've developed guidance and a checklist for assessing risks around sexual harassment at work. And this checklist is divided into 4 sections. Firstly, it looks at what is happening in your working environment. We know that there are certain factors that put people at greater risk of sexual harassment. For example, working alone with clients, customers, or patients, or working where alcohol is served. So this checklist in this regard, it's not an exhaustive list, and you can adapt it to specific workplaces, but it just helps identify those factors in the working environment that increase risk. Secondly, the checklist asks you to think about the characteristics of the workers in these environments. As I've said, we know through our research that sexual harassment is more prevalent for younger women, disabled women, BME workers, LGBT plus workers, and workers in insecure forms of work, such as agency work or zero-hour contracts. Thirdly, what we ask people to assess risks around are environments outside usual working hours and work locations. So work-related events or meetings or colleagues socialising. And then the checklist covers management structures, because as Alison was saying, we know that sexual harassment is rooted in power and the abuse of power. And it's really important that we look at kind of those risk factors where there are wide differentials in power. And the answers to this section can also be informed by responses to the climate survey, rather than just based on assumptions that people maybe have. So that if this checklist is used correctly and leads to action, it can lead to understanding of risks, identification of risks, and therefore better management of risks. Thirdly, is the development of an effective anti-sexual harassment policy. What we've done is we've worked with experts to develop a model policy that can be adapted for different workplaces, but covers all of the key elements that are needed in a policy. And moving on to the fourth step, which is training and communication program. You have a policy. It is hugely important that all workers, in particular managers, receive regular and repeated training on this policy, and that there is regular communication of a workplace's zero tolerance approach to sexual harassment, what constitutes sexual harassment, and what the workplace policy covers. And what we flag is that particular attention should be paid at induction and when workers join, so that you can ensure that all workers, however long they've been working in an organisation, have a shared understanding of what is expected around tackling sexual harassment. And we really need to ensure that all workers are covered, not just employees, but also freelancers and agency workers. And lastly, it's hugely important that progress is monitored and evaluated. And here's where that climate survey comes in. It should be repeated at regular intervals, so that progress against it can be measured. But it's not just kind of formal climate surveys. Things like exit interviews, where workers often feel more ready to speak openly. Information from those can be taken to inform progress on this. But I think what's really important here is an approach based in transparency, where not only are workers told the results of surveys, progress against surveys, but the kind of any hiccups are shared with them as well, so that there isn't a feeling that this issue is one that can't be talked about. So with this 5-step approach, with these materials that we've developed, we really hope that they give a framework for building those preventative cultures. And I think it's useful to read them with the EHRC's technical guidance on sexual harassment, which I can post in the chat as well, which kind of gives further information on a range of issues. But I'll hand it back over to you now, Anna, because I'm really keen to kind of get into some discussion and some questions around this.
Sure, thanks so much, Sue. As both Alison and Sue have mentioned, this is a suite of tools that we now have available for workplace reps to use to develop these policies with their management. I think it's important to stress as well that reps, while they're not responsible for the policy in the workplace, or ultimately they're not responsible ultimately for the culture, I think that reps can play a key role in helping to inform their colleagues, helping to inform their members about acceptable and unacceptable behaviour in the workplace. As we said, they're not ultimately responsible, but they can play a key role in promoting that good culture. Right. So as we've just seen, Sue's just posted a link also, but if you don't catch the links now, don't worry, we'll make sure they're all included in our follow-up email to this webinar. Right, we've had a bunch of questions that have come in so far. While I'm looking at them, I've also got a question for all you in the audience. Please, can you tell us in the chat if you've already got a policy on sexual harassment in your workplace and whether you think it's effective, whether you think it could be improved. We always like hearing what's happening on the ground, so to speak. It's both Sue and Alison are nodding. It's always good to hear this. Like, what if you have you got one? Does it work? What do you think needs to be changed? What elements of what we've already brought up do you think perhaps would be useful? Because I see a couple of people already saying, no, you haven't. That's really interesting as well. If you haven't got one, what do you think you'll be able to influence management with the tools that we've brought to your attention today? Right. So we've had quite a few questions. Our first one, I'm going to put to you both. It asks specifically about NDAs, so non-disclosure agreements that prevent women from speaking about their experience. Our questioner says that often this is the only option is to agree to a settlement with a confidentiality clause, allowing the perpetrator and the workplace to carry on regardless. NDA should never be used to cover up discrimination, bullying and harassment. And then this questioner goes on to say that they'll be submitting a motion to their union's Congress relating to this. Okay, let's just maybe some thoughts on NDAs in general, rather than the specific detail that this person has asked. Alison, can we maybe go to you first just to tell us a few things about NDAs? I've just taken you off mute.
I mean, if you're going for transparency, a non-disclosure agreement doesn't help. I think they really fall from that kind of legal mindset where employers are trying to save themselves from legal follow-up. So the basic answer is, if they're trying to change the culture, they shouldn't need non-disclosure agreements in the same way, would be my sort of basic answer.
Thanks, Alison. Sue, have you got any advice for reps when faced with this issue? We'd love to be able to, like we say, have a culture that doesn't need them, but what if they're faced with them in the day-to-day now?
Well, there's ACAS guidance that makes clear that non-disclosure agreements should not be used to silence the victims of sexual harassment. There's also the very useful technical guidance from the EHRC that people can turn to that covers that. And, you know, obviously we at the TUC have long held this view that non-disclosure agreements should only ever be used at the worker's request in these cases, and should never be used to silence victims and sweep sexual harassment under the carpet.
Thanks, Sue. We've had quite a few points raised in the chat and a question about third-party harassment. So you did mention that a policy should cover anyone in the workplace, like freelancers, the self-employed, as well as the regular workforce. But what about if there are customers or service users or any other third party in that situation? How can we help change the culture with regards to them, especially around the training issues, because obviously they're less likely to take part in a training program initiated by an employer? Alison.
So first of all, it's worth saying that the new legislative commitment does commit to doing more and going wider on this one. So there will be some sort of formal support coming. In the meantime, I think you can do practical things like change your recruitment criteria. If you don't, it's, for example, hospitality is a classic for this kind of thing. So if you don't focus on, sort of your hospitality criteria, hiring is basically, we want nice young ladies in short skirts kind of thing. If you don't do that and you start hiring a range and a mix of people, you're going to change the environment and stop making that sort of implicit suggestion. I think your risk assessment, as Sue's highlighted, is going to be really helpful, making sure that covers all those kind of things. Analyzing third-party experiences, whether it's suppliers or customers and this kind of thing, so that you can show if you're getting higher proportions or different types of incidents occurring from them, would help to focus management attention. And then specialized training, probably about sort of management support and how you do things. And there are, I think, a couple of mentions of examples of people doing things differently in our report. So, sort of manager support, calling out when it happens, but from somebody who's the appropriate person to do that, not necessarily the person who's experienced somebody being sexually harassing in one of those situations.
Sure, thank you, Alison. And I've just been reminded that we did a webinar about third-party harassment a few years ago, pre-coronavirus. Things may have changed, may have moved on since then. Sue, I'll put that question to you. And I think it's probably 3 years ago, if not more, that we did it. Have things moved on since then?
Well, things have moved on in terms of the fact that we have to remind ourselves that protections around third-party harassment were actually reduced by the government. So although it's welcome that they have now made a commitment to increase the protections around third-party harassment, it's kind of undoing the work that they did previously. But I think there are practical things that we can, make sure happen ahead of that kind of strengthening of workers' rights around that, in terms of really clear communication with third parties, in terms of customers, that's notices to customers, messages when people are on hold that make clear that harassment is not acceptable, and that there is follow through to protect workers where harassment occurs. And we know that for particular groups of workers during the pandemic, that third-party harassment, not necessarily sexual harassment, has increased considerably. For example, kind of retail workers, there are, significant issues during the pandemic, but it needs to form part of that policy, and it needs to be communicated around, and it needs to be followed up and acted on, so the policy actually means something to workers.
Sure, thank you, Sue. And again, these are issues that reps can negotiate to have included within the policy initially. They obviously management will be responsible for that policy ultimately, but it's about including these aspects in it so that it covers as many situations as possible and tries to prevent the harassment occurring in as many situations as possible. Just quickly on the question I asked you about whether you have workplace policies, I think it's really interesting to see so many people posting in the chat about their workplaces, and hopefully Alison and Sue will also find this helpful. A lot of you are saying that you don't have a separate sexual harassment policy. That these issues are covered in, for example, dignity at work, or violence and aggression is another one, or bullying and harassment. So I think that leads me to raise a question. How important do you consider it to be to have a separate policy on this, rather than what we're seeing, which is people saying they have it included in a different workplace policy? Alison, please.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That is specifically what we call for, is that it should be a standalone sexual harassment policy with 9 elements, including employees and how it's developed, and then the communication and the follow through. So that if you start saying, you know, we're going to take minor incidents more seriously, you actually do that, and you're setting a new normal.
Yeah, Sue, have we got any evidence across the union, across the movement at the moment, that, you know, things are moving away from this and that it's more effective?
What we found and what we hear is that if sexual harassment is included in a wider dignity at work policy, that it sometimes just gets lost. And we recommend that you do have a separate standalone policy, so those specific steps that are needed can be taken, and it can be given the relevant weight that it needs. And I think it's difficult to do that when it's just kind of buried as a small kind of part within another policy.
We absolutely, I suppose there's a danger there of everything being watered down, so it just gets lost, like exactly like you say, it's too diluted. So moving on to the issue that we touched on in the presentations about training and awareness in the workplace. A few people have posted about the education of other colleagues and information, and that there's sometimes a blurring of lines when something's non-physical. There's a blurring of lines, what is acceptable, what isn't. How can reps help there? What sort of information can they impart to members on this subject about what is and what isn't acceptable?
So I dive in?
Yeah, sorry, of course.
I think the first thing is the listening to the woman who's had the experience. And I keep saying woman, but I would like to acknowledge that we know sexual harassment happens to other people as well. Just that's what we focused on, and it's a lot of the majority. Is the listening, taking it seriously, because basically if it's unwanted, it's harassment. So you're having to deal with the fact that somebody who's ill-informed or old-fashioned or whatever thinks they're doing something that's not a big deal. And in fact, it's about the impact of that experience on the person who experiences it. So you've got some delicate work to do, and it's calls on great emotional intelligence and skills in that area to listen to the woman, and then possibly to have a difficult conversation with somebody else. Because for some people, it will be a matter of trying to educate them. Then there are plenty out there who are using sexual harassment as a tool of power, and at some level understand what they're doing. But there is I think there's a level of confusion, bad habits, and those you're trying to re-educate. And that's why I think things like the bystander training can be very interesting, and trying to get a common definition so that people can think, okay, gosh, I used to do this and I used to think it was okay, but actually I've listened to this training, I've listened to what's happening over here. I understand that, I can try and do better, and I can help other people and change my own behavior. So it is taking people on a journey. So I wasn't quite answered the question. Was that somewhat useful?
Absolutely, Alison, that's really helpful. And I think it's you've touched on a really key point there about bystander training. Kind of related, early in the new year, certainly, in the first couple of months of 2022, we are launching some training for reps, not specifically about sexual harassment, but about casework. And we all know that that's a rep's bread and butter. And one of the case study examples that we use is this, where someone has accused another member of harassment, and it's about helping them see what the issue is, why this is important, and why, crucially, this isn't acceptable behaviour. So do look out for that in the new year. It's not out there yet, it's coming, but maybe this is kind of similar to the bystander training that Alison just mentioned. Sue, have you got anything to add on that?
No, just to reiterate that there's quite a big awareness raising job to do in terms of what constitutes sexual harassment and how broad it is, and that quite often people think that what is actually sexual assault, so touching or groping or is sexual harassment, when it is so much more in terms of those verbal interventions that kind of create a hostile or intimidating or degrading environment, and that it doesn't have to be directed at somebody, that a comment or an image aimed at somebody else can sexually harass a third person, even though that comment or whatever is not kind of aimed at them. And I think it's really important to build that understanding, but also to build the understanding of those workplace cultures that support this kind of thing. Workplace cultures where women are put down, humiliated, ignored, that's kind of fertile ground for sexual harassment to happen. So I think as well as raising awareness about what sexual harassment is, it's about kind of working to create those environments where it's less likely for sexual harassment to happen.
Thanks, Sue. And before I move on to the last question that I think we've got time for today, just worth noting, one of the comments that was posted quite early on is about whether any of us have seen the HBO series Succession. I asked our speakers this before we went live, and they haven't seen it, and neither have I. But I do know that it's riddled with sexual harassment. Another TV program that springs to mind where this is the case is Mad Men, that some of you might remember from a few years ago. And I think these are really, they're not very comfortable to watch at times, but they do show the implications of sexual harassment in the workplace and how it can play out. So yeah, they're maybe good to watch to get an example here of how of what can happen. Okay, I just think the final question I'm going to put to you both before we wrap up, just one moment, is about the past 21 months that we've all been through. Now, I know for many people we've been working remotely almost all the time. Where we are communicating with our colleagues almost exclusively online. So, Alison, you mentioned that online sexual harassment has been occurring since COVID has been with us. But can you tell us a bit more about what that entails, the kind of numbers, and what we can do about that aspect of sexual harassment too, please? Because people wouldn't always assume that it could happen online. I think the perception is it has to be face to face.
Yeah, I mean, the best data we've got really talks about sort of change in harassment. So 1 in 5 women who had been sexually harassed said that it had increased or escalated since the start of the pandemic while they were working from home. So it's not an absolute figure, but just that it's sort of worse and more. I think there's a mix. For some people, if it changes the entire basis of the interaction, it can actually manage sexual harassment a bit. But for others, it opens them up to it, as Sue has already talked about, whether that's through lone working in effect because you were at home. Some people can sort of feel that, sort of the intimacy of a one-to-one Zoom call can, make it appropriate to get more personal and that kind of thing. So those kind of aspects starting to happen, if that makes some kind of sense.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, something we're also really interested in is the sort of explosion in WhatsApp groups related to work. And sometimes there is, because people use WhatsApp as a form of informal communication as well, where there are work-related discussions we're really concerned that there is a kind of higher likelihood of sexual harassment happening in those kind of situations, and we're going to be doing some work on that in the new year.
That's really interesting, Sue. Yeah, I think we've probably all noticed a lot more of that. If you were previously together with people all day, you're now communicating using probably your personal phone via WhatsApp. And yeah, I think that's a really interesting area. Okay, we're going to start to wrap up. As I've said, we'll send out all the links to the toolkit, to the accompanying resources to you later today. Also, the original report that Alison referenced that the Fawcett Society conducted, where a lot of our information on the prevalence of this has come from. So just to finish, Alison, can you just give us a sum up that maybe top 2 or 3 things for reps to take away from this, please?
I think it's the underlying culture and the fact that you need to have multiple things going on for it to work and kind of keep it up.
Thanks, Alison. Sue?
Absolutely. I would say follow the link I posted in the chat, have a look at our materials, and as Alison was saying, they're to be used as a group rather than in isolation from each other.
Thanks, Sue. So yeah, thank you everybody for tuning in today. I think we've had a really insightful discussion. We've had some excellent questions from you all, but I think it's also been great for us to hear what's going on in your workplaces. We really like hearing this, and especially that so many of you are saying that you don't have separate policies. It's interesting to see what you are doing or what you think might work in your workplace. So as I said, this is our last webinar of 2021. It's been a roller coaster year, hasn't it? We've done a lot, we've packed a lot in, and we plan to do even more in 2022. I think we're back the 3rd week of January. It might be a bit before that, so please don't quote me. But thank you all. Have a great festive season, whatever form it may take. And we'll see you in the new year for more webinars and more training on these key issues for workplace reps. So see you all soon, and bye-bye for now.